Good morning and welcome. It is such a joy to be here and to see so many beloved, familiar faces from over the years. We have people I understand from congregations all over Utah today. I don't know how far some of you have traveled, but I know some of you have traveled from the other end of the valley. Thank you for being here. As we gather, we bring the faithful sparks from our congregations across Utah to this sanctuary. May we ignite this flame for the strength to exist, resist, and persist, for the warmth of our faith community, and for the infinite possibilities of love.
Let's begin with song. I want to teach you a new song. I'll sing the first verse through, and then you join me on the next four verses. Ready? We're gonna keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Keep on moving forward. Never turning back. Never turning back. We're gonna keep on marching proudly. Keep on marching proudly. Keep on marching proudly. Never turning back. Never turning back. We're gonna keep on singing loudly. Keep on singing loudly. Keep on singing loudly. Never turning back. Never turning back. We're gonna keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Keep on loving boldly. Never turning back. Never turning back. We're gonna keep on. You got it. Work for change together. Work for change together. Never turning back. Never turning
Good morning. Boy, that got the blood circulating just fine. That's a great way to start. I want to begin briefly just inviting you to think about power. Think about power for a second. Not just who has it and who doesn't, but what is it really? I want to tell you that one of the attributes of power is that it gives those who have it the ability to define reality and the power to make others believe in their definition. We are experiencing the abuse of power today as our government systematically defines reality in terms of who has rights and who doesn't, defining reality in terms of who has dignity and who must suffer degradation. Now, suddenly, all of us are subjected to the narrow definition of whose life matters, and suddenly diversity and the inherent worth of all people are targets of disdain by the authorities currently in power. And what sends chills down our spines is that more and more citizens are believing in this new definition of who matters and who doesn't. Now, this represents a whole new experience for those outside of the LGBTQI community. America's love of a judgmental God has placed queer people historically on the margins of society, stripped of their dignity, lacking in power, deprived of human and civil rights. Police raids on gay bars were always routine. And we must not forget that the duty of the police is to safeguard the status quo. And thus they always have had the full license to bludgeon those who fail to conform to love and sexuality as defined by authorities who made the rules, governed by their Bibles and their bias. And so 50 years ago, in the wee hours of the morning on June 28, 1969, when the police entered the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village for another routine raid on drag queens and transgender people, surprise. The people who had been marginalized by the prevailing power brokers fought back as though their lives depended on stopping the degradation of who they were. Pride is the feeling one has about oneself. The opposite of pride is shame. And the Stonewall uprising 50 years ago was a proclamation. No more shame. Dignity is the right to integrate fully in society as a valued citizen with human and civil rights. The opposite of dignity is degradation, humiliation. And the Stonewall uprising 50 years ago was a proclamation. No more degradation. No more humiliation. Now, the very next year, 1970, the first gay pride parade took place in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago. And I am convinced that not a soul in 1970 could ever have imagined a gay pride parade in Salt Lake City. Now, here we are. We're all in it together. No more shame or humiliation for who one is, for who one loves, for how one understands one's own sexuality and gender. Resting deep in the soul of every human being is the desire to be treated as someone of value. And I believe what has changed so significantly in the past 50 years is that it is no longer just a desire to be of value, but it is a right. The right of every person, just as our First Unitarian Universalist principle declares that we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, no strings attached, no conditions to be satisfied. This is why we are Unitarian Universalists. It's not just the rhetoric that inspires, but the commitment. Whatever it takes, the commitment to assure the dignity of all people. And we know, especially in these unusual times, that arrogance accompanies power. And this arrogance of power itches to destroy the dignity of some citizens, destroy the inherent value of some people, and to create a new reality enforced by fear. Unitarian Universalists are marching today because we live by our first principle. Unitarian Universalists are marching today because no one should feel shame. No one should feel humiliation. And we march today in support of the struggle that came out of hiding 50 years ago and saying, we are not afraid. We will stand up to the forces that impose violence to protect an inhumane reality. We are marching to keep our nation a free and democratic society for all. We are marching for an inclusive reality that affirms the dignity of all people. We are, in essence, marching for our lives.
As we prepare to join the marchers out on the streets of Salt Lake City, we pause to remember.
Even if it happened before our lifetimes.
We hold the names and stories in our minds, and we commit them to memory.
We remember that once there was no pride.
We remember that the first pride was a riot.
We remember that they would have erased us.
We remember that a queer woman shouted at the crowd, "Why don't you do something?"
We remember their names.
Marcia P. Johnson,
Sylvia Rivera,
Stormy Delavery.
Victoria Cruz.
We remember their names, their stories, their struggles.
And we remember that there are trans, genderqueer, gay and lesbian people living and working right beside us every day.
They are asking us, why don't you do something?
And we remember that when we march on these streets,
we are marching on holy ground.
Beloved friend, give us the courage to march beside one another today.
To be ourselves in our fullness, just as we were born.
To inhabit our own dignity and to honor the dignity of our queer neighbors with every step that we take.
Amen.
Good morning. I'm Reverend Bob LaVallee. I serve our sister congregation, South Valley UU Society, just a few miles down the road. And it's such a pleasure to be here and share the pulpit with Tom, Liz, Monica. It's amazing. So, I want to talk about courage for a minute here. I'm a cisgender, heterosexual, white, upper middle class man, so I've never had much reason to be courageous. And because of that, I really don't think I know much about courage, or didn't. But not too long ago, somebody showed me the meaning of the word. So a couple years ago, I was living in Buffalo, New York, and I was part of a group called Showing Up for Racial Justice. And we did some cool stuff, like sitting in coffee shops and inviting folks to have a conversation about race. Talk about creating an awkward moment. Or disrupting the Trump campaign rally in 2016 and getting dragged out of the arena by the sheriffs. That was actually less awkward than the coffee shops. My favorite was when we occupied the sheriff's office to protest the county jail. The jail there has a suicide rate that's 5 times the national average, and the sheriff just revels in not being accountable. So a group of us went in to occupy his office, and being really well organized, we had already arranged who had what role, who would be shooting video, who would be the legal observer, who would be the liaison to the police, and who would be actually getting arrested. Me. So I was part of the group that was going to take an arrest, and in my group was 3 other folks, 2 women who purely by coincidence were both lesbians, and a person who is gender nonconforming, and I'll call them Rain. That's not their real name. So we all marched into the public foyer of the office and started chanting, and the news cameras were rolling, and we held a banner that said, "Sheriff Howard is a murderer," and eventually the deputies got around to doing some arresting. So all the folks who weren't getting arrested cleared out, and the sheriffs turned their attention to us 4, sitting on the floor, chanting Black Lives Matter. To paraphrase Cornel West, I wonder if courage is what integrity looks like in public. Or perhaps courage is what happens when love meets the truth. When love meets the truth. When love meets the truth, we're compelled to do things by a different calculus than what we might bring to our daily life. When love meets the truth, I might find myself doing something that I don't want to do, but I have to do. So getting arrested really was scary. They put us in handcuffs and they brought us in back. A deputy held my arm while a supervisor came up and screamed in my face. I was wearing a collar, this collar as a matter of fact, and he was deeply disturbed that I was using this symbol of Christian authority to question, maybe even shame, his workplace. And then we were brought into the bowels of the holding center there, and I was the first in our group to get processed. And there was a long, nervous conversation among the deputies about whether to strip search me or not. And they decided not to, I guess in deference to the collar. And I was relieved that I went first because I'm not sure they would have extended that courtesy to my colleagues, either out of sexism or homophobia or just a general need to humiliate them. So the process seemed to take forever, and since I went first and I was pushed out the back door first, I didn't see how everyone else was handled. And it was only after that I suddenly realized how brave, how courageous Rain had been in that moment. In that atmosphere of intimidation and control, in that place of domination, Rain refused to tell the deputies their gender. Rain was civil. Rain didn't lose their cool, unlike the supervisor who screamed in my face. And Rain refused to let them check the box, male or female. I learned this when we debriefed after we were all let out, and this tells me how much my privilege blinds me to the suffering of others. It wasn't until then that I got a deeper sense about how that act of nonviolent civil disobedience was so much more dangerous for Rain. And it was more dangerous, it was more likely to end up in violence for Rain, not because of anything they did, but because of in that crucible moment, in that moment, Rain insisted on living into their personhood with complete integrity. The less brave path, less courageous path would have been to make a concession to these men and their threats and allow them to check a gender box. I wouldn't have judged Rain for making that choice. But in that moment, when love met truth, Rain chose courage and integrity, and above all, themselves. All of us here are faced with that choice every day, actually every minute, right? But it's important to remember that as long as transphobia and homophobia are part of our culture and are part of some of our religious traditions and part of our laws, as long as that's true, then for some folks, the choice to be themselves will require an act of courage. The choice to be themselves is an act of courage. And that's why we march. Amen, and blessed be.
Well, for the first song, I had enough voice for 3 verses. I'm counting on y'all for all 3 this time. I invite you to rise in body or in spirit, and let's sing around the welcome table. Thank you for bearing with me. As we close our service today, may we build a table where room never runs out, where there's always another chair, another dish, plenty more, and love to go around and then some. And may we march today proudly, boldly, fiercely for pride. Thank you all for being here today. First Church, where are you at? All right. South Valley, where are you at? All right. South Valley bringing their voices. Utah Valley. All right, Utah Valley. All right, Cache Valley. Cache Valley, anybody from Logan? Woo-hoo! Awesome, awesome. St. George. Anybody from St. George? And who's number 6? What's our number 6? Ogden. How did I forget Ogden? Ogden in the house. All right. Thank you all for being, what a joy to have all the Utah congregations in the house at the same time. Man, what a treat. What a treat. All right. Okay. What? Now's your chance.
Now's my chance.
Get you a picture.
Will you raise your hands again from the different, okay, Ogden, raise your hands.
Ogden.
Utah County, raise
Utah Valley. All right.
your hands. Okay,
Yes, yes.
Cache Valley? Wait, Cache Valley?
Cache Valley.
And St. George.
I don't think we got anybody from St. George. Yes, yes, yes.
All right, and South Valley.
So good, so good. Okay.